the summer of 1896, a young ethnologist named George Pepper knelt inside a sealed room buried at the heart of a New Mexico canyon and found something that did not add up. Two people lay at the center of the chamber, surrounded by more wealth than almost any other burial ever recovered in the ancient Southwest. Turquoise beyond easy counting, carved shell ornaments, ceremonial staffs, flutes inlaid with stone. Around those two, sharing the same sealed floor, lay many more people. None of them wore anything like that wealth. None of them had been given anything close to that care. Pepper did not have a word for what he was looking at, but the room already had one. Long before his shovel ever touched that floor, the people who lived beside this canyon had a name for the great house rising above it, and a story that came bound to that name, a story they had been telling for longer than anyone could say about who had truly built it and why. Why would a single sealed room hold two of the richest burials ever found in the ancient Southwest, and more than a dozen others with almost nothing at all? Why did a Navajo name for this building already exist, generations before any archaeologist ever opened it? What kind of structure requires more than 200,000 pieces of timber hauled by hand from mountain ranges the builders never lived near? And why does the story the Navajo tell about this place not describe a people who built it out of pride, but a people who were forced to? To understand why those questions still don't have clean answers, it helps to start with what the first outsiders expected to find in this canyon, and how quickly that expectation collapsed. Chaco Canyon sits in the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, a place with no permanent river, thin soil, and rainfall too unreliable to support the kind of population its ruins imply. When American surveyors first mapped the canyon in the middle of the 1800s, they assumed they were looking at modest ceremonial ruins, the kind of scattered stonework left behind by small seasonal communities. Early travelers who passed through in the middle of the century described the walls in passing, as curiosities worth a paragraph in a survey report, nothing more. Nobody arriving expected to find buildings that would still be counted, more than 100 years later, among the largest pre-industrial structures ever raised in North America. That assumption did not survive contact with the site itself. In 1887, an architect and ethnologist named Victor Mindeleff arrived in the canyon on behalf of the Bureau of Ethnology to conduct the first systematic architectural survey of its great houses. What he measured did not resemble anything modest. Pueblo Bonito alone, the largest of the great houses, contained more than 600 rooms arranged across 4 and 5 stories, built around a D-shaped plaza with a precision of masonry that outsiders had assumed belonged only to more familiar ancient civilizations. Mindeleff's survey, published in 1891 as part of the Bureau's official reporting, remains one of the earliest scientific documents to state plainly what the scale of Chaco Canyon actually implied. This was not a village. It was the architectural center of something far larger, built with an ambition that had no obvious local explanation. The deeper the investigation went, the less sense the ordinary explanations made. Chaco Canyon has no forest. It never did. Yet analysis of the roof beams recovered from its great houses shows timber hauled from mountain ranges as far as 50 to 70 miles away, using no draft animals, no wheels, and no rivers capable of floating logs that distance. Estimates place the total number of large timbers used across the canyon's great houses at more than 200,000, each one carried by human labor alone across desert terrain, to be raised into position with a level of engineering precision that still draws comparison to construction efforts many times its apparent resources. The roads made even less sense than the timber, radiating outward from the canyon in nearly perfect straight lines, some running for more than 60 miles across open desert. The Chacoan road system was engineered to a width of roughly 30 feet, graded and in places cut directly through solid rock rather than routed around it. Wheeled vehicles did not exist here. Draft animals did not exist here. And yet these roads were built as if speed and directness mattered more than the labor required to achieve them, connecting Chaco to outlying communities across a stretch of the desert Southwest, whose full extent archaeologists are still mapping today. Chaco was never an isolated site either. Archaeologists have mapped more than 100 outlying communities across the San Juan Basin and beyond, each one built with the same distinctive masonry style, many of them linked back to the canyon by those same engineered roads. At its height, some estimates place the number of people connected to this network in the tens of thousands, spread across a region the size of a small country, all of it apparently coordinated from a canyon with no river and no forest of its own. Whoever organized this did not simply build one impressive house, they built and maintained an entire regional system, one whose center of gravity kept pulling resources inward rather than distributing them outward. Among those resources was something that should not have been in the canyon at all. Excavations across several Chaco great houses have recovered the remains of scarlet macaws, tropical birds native to regions more than 1,000 miles to the south in what is now Mexico. These birds could not have survived the journey on their own. They were carried, alive, across deserts and mountain ranges, traded hand to hand along a route that had to remain reliable enough, season after season, to keep delivering live animals rather than feathers or bones. Whatever organized Chaco Canyon had a reach that extended far beyond the southwest, and a level of consistency that a loose, informal network of independent communities does not typically produce. Feathers from these same birds, along with copper bells cast far to the south, turn up repeatedly across the canyon's great houses, evidence of a supply line that had to be planned, protected, and repeated across many years to function at all. Then came the great kivas, the round ceremonial chambers sunk into the earth at the heart of nearly every settlement, some of them aligned with such precision to the rising and setting points of the sun at the solstices that the alignment cannot easily be dismissed as coincidence. Walls at Pueblo Bonito itself have been shown to correspond to the same solar cycle, embedded into the architecture itself rather than layered on afterward. The stonework itself only deepened the puzzle. Chaco's builders developed a masonry technique now known as core and veneer construction, in which a rubble-filled interior wall was faced on both sides with carefully selected, thinly dressed sandstone, arranged in deliberate decorative bands that shifted in pattern across different construction phases. Producing this kind of veneer required quarrying, sorting, and shaping an enormous quantity of stone with a level of consistency that implies specialized labor working under some form of oversight, not scattered households building however each family saw fit. Whoever organized this canyon was not simply building shelter, they were building something coordinated across astronomy, transportation, labor, and ceremony, on a scale that implies a level of centralized authority nobody had expected to find in the 11th century Southwest. And then, in 1896, came Room 33. George Pepper was working for the Hyde exploring expedition, a project funded by the wealthy Hyde brothers and affiliated with New York's American Museum of Natural History, when his team broke into a sealed chamber inside Pueblo Bonito that had remained untouched for roughly 8 centuries. What they found inside would become, and remains today, one of the richest single burial deposits ever recovered anywhere north of central Mexico. 2 individuals lay at the center of the room, resting on a floor built above an older one, surrounded by tens of thousands of pieces of turquoise shell trumpets, wooden ceremonial staffs, effigy figures, and inlay work of a quality and quantity that stunned even experienced excavators. Among the objects recovered were carved wooden staffs sheathed in turquoise mosaic, cylindrical baskets inlaid with shell, flageolets carved from bird bone, and ornaments incorporating materials brought from both coasts of the continent. Later analysis would suggest these 2 individuals were treated with a degree of ceremonial distinction that had no clear parallel anywhere else in the ancient Southwest, and few clear parallels anywhere north of central Mexico. But the room did not end with those 2. Beneath and around them, packed into the same sealed space, lay the remains of more than a dozen additional people, given none of that same treatment. No turquoise, no ceremonial staffs, no individual distinction in how they had been laid to rest. Some later skeletal analysis has pointed to signs of trauma among a portion of these remains, a finding some researchers interpret as evidence of violence connected to the room's final use, while other researchers caution that the evidence is ambiguous and open to other explanations. That disagreement has never fully resolved. What is not in dispute is the basic, uncomfortable shape of the room itself. Extraordinary wealth and reverence concentrated on 2 individuals, and a much larger group of people sealed into the same space with almost none of it. Pepper catalogued what he found with the careful descriptive language of his era, listing bead counts and inlay patterns the way a naturalist might list specimens, without ever fully accounting for the imbalance staring back at him from the floor of the room itself. He did not, and could not, explain why the room was built this way, or what relationship connected the two honored dead to the many who were not. That explanation, if it exists at all, would not come from his excavation notes. It would come from a story that had already been recorded several years earlier by a different kind of investigator entirely. In the 1880s and 90s, an army surgeon and self-trained ethnologist named Washington Matthews, stationed at Fort Wingate near Navajo country, began recording the origin traditions of the Navajo people directly from tribal elders and singers who held the stories. Among the material he collected and later published, most fully in his 1897 work on Navajo legend, was an account tied specifically to Chaco Canyon, one the Navajo had been telling long before any excavation ever took place there. The Navajo already had a name for Pueblo Bonito. They called it Kintiel, meaning broad house, and the story bound to that name did not describe a community of free builders raising a monument to their own success. It described a stranger. According to the tradition Matthews recorded, a figure known as the Gambler arrived at Chaco from the south, a being sometimes called Nokoilpi, he who wins men at play. The account was not recorded as an isolated folktale. Matthews collected it as part of the broader Navajo origin and migration legend, the same body of tradition that explains how the Navajo people understand their own history moving through the landscape of the Southwest, which suggests the Gambler story was never treated by its own tellers as separate from real historical memory. He challenged the people of the canyon to games of chance, one contest after another, foot races, a hidden ball game, a form of dice, and he did not lose. Some versions of the story, passed down specifically among certain Navajo tellers, describe the Gambler winning not entirely through skill. He is said to have fed his opponents a drink or a dish laced with ground datura, a plant known throughout the region for its disorienting hallucinogenic properties, leaving them unable to judge the games clearly while he played on with total control. Whether that detail reflects a literal historical practice or a symbolic explanation for why no one could ever beat him is something no written record can settle. But the effect within the tradition is total. Game after game, the people lost everything they owned. Then they bet their own labor. Then, having nothing else left, they bet themselves. The Gambler won those bets too, and it was with that debt, according to the tradition, that the great houses were built. Pueblo Bonito, Chetro Kettle, Peñasco Blanco, Wijiji. Room by room, wall by wall, an enslaved population raised the very structures Victor Mindeleff would one day measure in astonishment, structures whose scale nobody, without this account, could easily explain. Is it coincidence that a tradition describing forced, coordinated, large-scale construction lines up so precisely, with a site that required exactly that kind of labor to exist at all? Is it coincidence that a room holding two individuals treated like royalty, surrounded by more people treated like nothing, sits inside a house whose own name means the place where people were one? Why would a community invent and then carefully preserve for generations a story that reflects so poorly on the outcome, rather than a version that flatters its ancestors instead? And is it coincidence that the story survived, intact, in a community that had every reason to forget a history of servitude, rather than preserve it? What can be said, without speculation, is that the tradition and the architecture describe the same underlying shape. A structure too large for its landscape, a labor force too large for its resources, a concentration of wealth and ceremony too extreme in one sealed room to be evenly distributed among equals. Oral tradition is a legitimate historical source, but like any historical source, it has to be weighed against the physical record rather than substituted for it, and here, weighed carefully, the two accounts do not contradict each other. They fill in each other's gaps. According to the tradition, the Gambler's reign did not last forever. The holy people, watching what had happened to the canyon's people, are said to have conspired against him, using a game of their own devising, one he could not manipulate the way he had manipulated the others. When he finally lost, the story does not end with simple justice. Some versions describe him being cast upward, shot into the sky itself, where he is said to remain as a distant point of light, still visible, still watching the canyon he once ruled. Freed from their debt, the people of Chaco are said to have scattered, leaving the great houses behind them, abandoning the canyon that had been built on their forced labor. That detail, more than any other in the tradition, sits uncomfortably close to something the archaeological record actually shows. Chaco Canyon's great houses did not remain occupied indefinitely. Following a severe and sustained drought, the majority of Chaco's population had emigrated from the canyon by roughly 1140 and by around 1250. Even Chetroke'tl, one of the last great houses still in use, had been fully vacated. Archaeologists studying this collapse have proposed drought, resource exhaustion, and social upheaval as contributing causes, and all of these explanations remain part of an active, ongoing academic debate that has never fully closed. Whether the ending preserved in Navajo tradition, a forced population finally released and walking away from the place of its servitude, reflects some memory of that same historical unraveling, or whether the timing is simply an echo that feels sharper in hindsight than it was in fact, remains an open question, one this documentary is not in a position to resolve. More than a century after Pepper opened that sealed room, Chaco Canyon still resists easy explanation. The roads still run straight across the desert toward destinations archaeologists continue to debate. The solar alignments still track the solstice sun with a precision that implies decades, if not generations, of careful observation. The timber still had to come from somewhere its builders could not have reached without enormous, sustained, coordinated effort. And the room Pepper found in 1896 still holds 2 people surrounded by wealth, and more than a dozen surrounded by none of it, a contradiction no excavation report has ever fully explained. What the Navajo tradition offers is not proof. It is a framework, one that was being told long before archaeology arrived to measure the walls it describes, and one that happens to account with unsettling precision for exactly the kind of imbalance the physical evidence keeps turning up, a structure built beyond its landscape's means, a population organized beyond what voluntary labor typically produces, a room where equality clearly did not apply. Whether that imbalance came from ambition, coercion, trade obligations owed to distant partners, or something the written record will simply never recover, remains, by every account historians are willing to put in writing, an unresolved question, one that no single discipline, working alone, has managed to close. The Navajo Nation's own relationship to Chaco Canyon has never depended on what any excavation confirmed. Long after Pepper's expedition packed its finds off to a museum thousands of miles away, Navajo communities living near the canyon continued to regard Kintiel and the other great houses as places carrying real historical weight, tied to a specific story rather than to vague, undifferentiated antiquity. That continuity matters because it means the tradition Matthews recorded was never a single conversation captured at a convenient moment. It was, and in many communities still is, a living account, maintained independently of whatever archaeology eventually chose to verify or dispute. Perhaps that is the honest shape of this story. Archaeology can measure a room, count its turquoise, and note the absence of ceremony in the burials pressed in beside it. It can survey a road, a kiva, a solar alignment, and confirm that all of it required more coordination than a small community could likely have organized on its own. But it cannot tell us, with the certainty the historical record would demand, whether the story bound to this canyon's own name describes something that actually happened, or something the people who lived beside it needed to believe had happened, in order to make sense of what had been built on their ancestors' backs. Some interpretations here remain genuinely unresolved, and that uncertainty is not a gap in the research. It is the research. Thank you for watching. If documentaries like this one, built on physical evidence and indigenous oral tradition held to the same standard, are the kind of history you want more of, consider subscribing. And before you go, I want to ask you directly, if a name for this house existed before anyone dug into it, and a story about forced labor was already attached to that name, What do you think it would take for archaeology to finally take a legend that's specific as seriously as it takes a sealed room full of turquoise? I'll see you in the next documentary.